So let's start. I figure I started to just talk about the regulatory landscape, and I tend to break this up into a few different buckets because, honestly, when we think about our risk, I think about it in kind of in this way, and it's a little different on the screen how I'm going to explain it. But the first risk is always kind of DOJ criminal risk, right? The second risk is SEC agency enforcement risk, and I put it in that order because in crypto, as in life, you may be willing to take some type of regulatory risk because some is unclear. But I think where my advice internally always is we're really never willing to take any sort of criminal risk. And where crypto transacts over that criminal risk kind of threshold is you typically see it around money laundering, money transmission, these type of statutes under the Bank Secrecy Act that become highly sensitive to the government and government agencies. In fact, when we speak to regulators, this is always the number one thing they bring up. They don't necessarily want to talk about whether a certain token's a security, yada yada yada. But your average person in Congress really cares about is crypto being used to fund terrorism in North Korea at some level, as you'd hope they would care about. And it's something we take really seriously as well. And so we can talk about what that kind of money transmission risk, we'll touch on a little bit on this risk. But the more in the news, and I think more on the thoughts of people looking to be, well-meaning entrepreneurs in the space is really that SEC enforcement risk and what makes the US kind of different than the rest of the world. So obviously forgive me if I'm going too basic and anyone tell me to go higher, deeper. But obviously in the United States, as opposed to other countries, we have a CFTC and the SEC. The CFTC governs, right, as Commodity Future Trading Commission, basically derivatives and commodities. And the SEC was meant to govern securities. And in the Securities Exchange Act that defines securities, you have the things that you would typically see, like stocks, bonds. But then we also have this concept of an investment contract. That's not something you see in the UK. You don't see it in France. You don't see it in Singapore. And effectively, it's been weaponized by the current SEC to draw a very broad scope that anything sold for profit, when there's an expectation of profit by the people buying it from some sort of centralized team, you can make an argument not only that transaction is a securities transaction subject to registration, but also kind of anything that stems from that transaction. And so that's where we are today. So when I take a look at what are we watching, we are looking very closely, obviously, at this SEC enforcement risk that at some level in the U.S. has had a chilling effect. And we say that because GSR is obviously a global firm, so we kind of see the other side of this, where we go to Hong Kong, we go to Singapore, we go to the UK. It's doors wide open. What can we do to help? At some level, for the past 4 years, that has not been the case in the United States, given the view of the SEC. And so what are the cases we're watching? The big ones in the news that matter to GSR, and we can talk about ones that might matter to projects a little bit more, are the exchange cases, right? So this is Coinbase, Kraken, Binance. They're all kind of different flavors of the same case, right? The SEC says, hey, there are token projects out there that sold their tokens in an investment contract. Therefore, the tokens stemming from that transaction are forever securities, so that when people buy and sell them on the platforms, they're also engaging in an investment contract, therefore a regulated securities transaction, and all those platforms would have to be regulated. We've even seen a further extension of that in the Cumberland case. This is a recent case against a well-known arm of DRW that transact as a broker in crypto assets. And they've basically made the same exchange case argument they've made, is that, but also saying, even if you don't host an exchange, just simply transacting as a broker in these crypto assets could cause you to have to register as a broker dealer. The sick joke, as we all know, is that DRW, like others, have gone in, like Coinbase, tried to register, but even if you were to get these registrations, that doesn't allow you to transact in these assets because they're not otherwise regulated assets. So the SEC has created a kind of catch-22 where, oh, you have to come in and register, but then if you register, you can't transact, with the ultimate goal of trying to, I think, change behavior in the crypto industry, but really dampen down speculation outside of Bitcoin and ETH. And it remains to be seen whether that's lawful tactic, right? So not only are these cases in the courts, but they're also being sued by several players as well, including now Crypto.com. And so where do these stand? We're most likely to get clarity in two cases, one Coinbase and one Ripple. In the Coinbase case, they've asked for what they called interlocutory appeal, basically an express appeal to the Second Circuit to hear responses to their motion to dismiss, right? And ultimately, it's the same issue as the Ripple case, which is reached final judgment, where in the Ripple case, the judge made a bifurcated ruling. The judge said, "Hey, where Ripple sold tokens on exchanges to unidentified buyers in what they call blind bid-ask transactions, those were not investment contracts because the people buying them weren't entering into effectively a contract with the Ripple Foundation, the Ripple founders, with a kind of an expectation that they were going to gain on the based on the work of others. But where Ripple sold directly to these institutions in direct bilateral sales, those were securities transactions subject to penalty. Ripple had hundreds of millions of dollar penalty enforced. That came to final judgment at the district court level, and now the SEC is appealing that to the Second Circuit, and Ripple's lodging a cross appeal. And so a ruling at the Second Circuit, either in the Ripple case, which is more about primary transactions, or in the Coinbase case, which is mostly about secondary transactions, will give us a better sense about how the appellate courts and then potentially the Supreme Court will look at this issue around Howey, which is the test for how you determine whether something is an investment contract, right? And whether the SEC has gone too far in extending that definition and therefore their authority over a lot of crypto. And in the meantime, we know that their intent is to continue to lodge these kind of enforcement actions. That being said, we all know we have an election in 2 weeks, and where that goes under a different administration, whether it's under a Harris administration or a Trump administration, I think would change, and we can talk about what the differences might be in both those administrations. The second set of cases goes back to kind of what I said before around DOJ national security concerns, and this is where I think the government is showing very little flexibility, and it's more of a DOJ style, Department of Justice cases, and this is where I think there's less legal room, perhaps, although we will see. So Tornado Cash is an example of where obviously you could take your crypto assets and anonymously swap them into an asset, so you could kind of obscure the history of the public blockchain transactions and come out with a clean asset. Unfortunately, that was being heavily used. This is now public knowledge by the DPRK out of North Korea. And that's something that governments around the world just will not be okay with. But what happened is they took the unprecedented step of prosecuting, the developers behind the Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet platform, right? So these are people that publish code to the internet and are now being charged with effectively operating an unlicensed money service business. And again, that's an extension of the Bank Secrecy Act beyond what even FinCEN's own guidance has been for years. And it remains to be seen exactly how that's going to play out. My point being that those cases come with serious, those people have been arrested and come with criminal liability, whereas the SEC is civil liability. So you can see the difference in severity. Elsewhere, I think what we're looking at is, okay, all this is happening with the SEC and the DOJ, and there's cases with the CFTC we won't have time to talk about today, unless anyone has specific questions. But what is Congress doing, if anything, to address that? We're seeing potential proposals now that are pretty serious come out of both the House and the Senate. In fact, the full House has passed a bill called FIT 21. And FIT 21 would provide a comprehensive regulation for crypto, unfortunately, it has some issues that I think we can talk about a little bit today. And then in the Senate, there's a lot of movement behind a totally different bill in the Senate Agriculture Committee called the Digital Commodity Consumer Protection Act that would effectively regulate crypto like we do derivatives in the United States and give more authority over to the SEC, excuse me, to the CFTC. Um, Elsewhere, I think I just noted here, and we won't spend a lot of time, is it's very difficult, even if you set up abroad, to avoid the long arm of the U.S. justice system, um, uh, given how they now view the definition of U.S. person. So, just to give you an example, in the commodities world, it used to be if you dealt with a Cayman fund and that Cayman fund happened to have staff in the United States, it was a non-U.S. person for purposes of U.S. commodities laws and whether you would be concerned about the SEC or CFTC coming after you. Now, you would see in the settlement that Binance paid a $4 million fine, $4 billion fine, excuse me, in connection with their settlement with both the DOJ and the CFTC. And in that, they basically said, even if you're an offshore fund, if you have staff deploying algorithms onto Binance or trading onto Binance from the United States, that those entities and people are going to be viewed as U.S. persons. And so it's this extension of U.S. persons. So if you really want to avoid the long reach of the U.S., you have to be kind of completely offshore and have no one in the United States. Something to think about, and we can talk about again in more detail. So I say all of this quickly to kind of just recap that the regulatory posture in the United States for the last 4 years has been challenging. It's been mostly challenging from the SEC enforcement standpoint, but not only. And that we really do need Congress to step up and provide a framework where the rules of the road are clear. Luckily, I think there are a lot of supporters in Congress now who want to push this forward, but we do need leadership from the top that wants to see this happen as well. And everything's basically on hold with the election, and it's going to reshake everything, and we'll see where the snow globe comes after the election. At the same time, however, we're seeing some real positive developments globally, right? So starting January 1st, the uniform MiCA legislation is going to go into effect in Europe, which will allow effectively trading and listing of crypto assets in the European market. It comes with a lot of requirements and limitations that makes it somewhat of a closed garden, but it is pretty clear rules of the road and it's pretty flexible, I think, in ways we could talk about. In fact, it will allow token projects to potentially even raise money directly from the public, from public listings, in a way that even where the best listings, the best regulation proposed in the United States is not at this time proposed to accomplish. Um, Separately, we're seeing strong development in Hong Kong and the UK, obviously Singapore as well. GSR has a license in Singapore. We expect others to get licenses in Hong Kong as they continue to expand their regulation. So these are relatively clear rules of the road. It just so happens to be the biggest market for crypto is still in the United States, and people are waiting to see what happens here. I think to really till we really start seeing traction. I think in some of these other markets. So why don't I pause there? I can keep going unless there are any questions. I just wanted to kind of take a second to see if there's anyone had any specific questions or anything that's worth kind of diving deeper into. All right, cool. Why don't we talk about something that's somewhat interesting is where do we see projects who are launching tokens evaluate this regulatory risk spectrum, right? So given that the SEC effectively views every digital asset other than Bitcoin as a security, um, what are projects doing? And I put here to the kind of right of the screen the various decisions we see projects evaluating as they think about the current situation. And again, I think it's important to mention this could change pretty quickly with new legislation. But what are they looking at, right? I think they're determining whether at first they want to establish more of a US nexus. And that could be along its own risk spectrum, right? Some teams are completely set up abroad for this reason because they're extremely regulatory averse. A lot of teams are in the United States, but they establish a non-US distribution point for tokens, right? So you'll see a lot of foundations set up in typically the Caribbean to look at distributing tokens. You also see DAOs typically set up offshore as well, although there's an increasing analysis of some interesting onshore options. You see projects taking a different view about airdrops, right? So I think there's a reasonable view that airdrops are not a security, right? But given the current regulatory environment, people are taking extreme measures to protect themselves where they think makes sense from their business perspective, and they're looking at geofencing the airdrops, right? Where you see various situations where they do not allow U.S. persons to receive those tokens. They'll also do things like non-transferability, right? Well, maybe you get the token, but you can't transact in it. And lastly, when they come up with these, when they launch a token, right, they're determining whether to pursue U.S. listings at all. And all of this has to be kind of evaluated in the context of what are your commercial objectives, where are your users, and how do you want this to play out? And people are looking at all these different levers they can pull depending on what's their risk appetite, what's the status of their own token, right? Are you a layer one? Are you a DeFi token? Do you have other risk you're concerned about from a US regulatory perspective? And then pulling these various levers to, at one hand, at some level avoid U.S. regulating. On the other hand, some are embracing it completely, including Trump coin, and trying to abide by the U.S. securities laws and securities and commodities laws the best they can, right? So ultimately, the point here is to get good advice from counsel to understand your various options, understand your own risk tolerance, and so you design a token launch that makes sense for you to the extent you're pursuing a token as part of your project. Um, Earlier, I talked a little bit about Fit 21, right, which is the leading proposal in the US Congress now for regulating crypto in the United States. And I think what's interesting about it is it would create a bifurcated market between the SEC and CFTC. So effectively, right up top here, you have like typical fundraising, right, where you have fundraising of initial raise, um, a functional network and a decentralized network. What they've tried to do is kind of look at this pathway of fundraising and token generation and launching and match up the securities and commodities law. So that what they effectively say is all insiders in the purple and orange buckets here would be subject to a 12-month holding period minimum where they get the tokens. And then only when that token network becomes decentralized could they sell into like the public markets. And the public markets would be populated only with users that receive tokens from airdrops, and mining and those type of kind of typical. So not insiders, not VCs. And it's an interesting solution to a complicated regulatory problem. The issue is you end up in a somewhat bifurcated trading market where you'd have where tokens trading in this kind of SEC market up top here in blue, right? At the same time, you have tokens trading in the CFTC market, right? So all the airdrop tokens and the mine tokens. And if you have the markets trading in, you have the tokens trading in two separate markets, you could see how this ends up in poor liquidity and disjointed pricing, and effectively it's bad for users and for and we think for projects as well. So on one hand, this is my personal opinion, not necessarily the opinion of everyone at GSR or everyone elsewhere, but there's a real question about how this would work in practice. And I think with the proposals in the Senate, what you're seeing is a way to avoid this, and that perhaps we can get everything into one combined market and just say, so long as it's not otherwise a stock or a bond, maybe it's a more like a trading card, and we could treat them like commodities. And so it goes back to, are we going to try to play around with the idea that Howey is forever law, right? The investment contract definition is forever law, or are we going to define crypto assets as something different? And I think there's good arguments both ways. And I think what you'll see a lot of times where there's people arguing for Fit 21, I think the argument which is well founded, which is you need to protect retail from getting dumped on from effectively insiders, and that what you don't want are projects to launch a coin, be able to then sell it for 5 cents and immediately sell it to retail for $1. Part of part of that's the backbone to the high float, low high FTV, low float issue we have now in the crypto markets. And this is one of the proposals I think to try to address that. But I think the point, and this is the point we've been making, is what this tends to miss is liquidity and access to tokens and unified trading and fungibility with international markets is probably just as important. So, we look to hopefully see this addressed in the next round of legislation. And this just talks a little bit about what they mean when they talk about decentralized, right? I call this decentralized Valhalla. And you can take a look at this screen and look at the proposals in Fit 21. But for a project to ever reach this level of decentralization would take a long time, right? It includes no one owning more than 20% of the tokens, unilateral authority to direct the voting, and take no unilateral authority to get the voting greater than 20%. So you really need to disperse ownership of control in order to get decentralization. And so part of the debates happening behind closed doors now is, should we be encoding decentralization into the proposed legislation as a factor in whether a token becomes a non-security? Or do we think these tokens, by their very nature, being mostly utility tokens effectively, are not securities in the first place, right? And I think this is a lot of the debate, and there's good arguments both sides, and happy to dig into it if anyone had any thoughts or questions on that specifically. But I think whether and how we require decentralization, and if we do, would set us apart from the rest of the global regulatory regime, which as of now that's not a factor in how they regulate digital assets in any other market that we operate in. So, um, that's that. I know I'm speaking fast and running through a lot of things. I thought something else that might be helpful for everyone is maybe a second on DeFi. I don't know if are there people in this cohort kind of considering DeFi projects? I assume so, potentially.
Yeah, definitely.
So this kind of goes back to the point I made before, which is in DeFi, if you look at Tornado Cash and Samurai, it comes with this fun extra element of criminal liability. And why is that? Because ultimately the government takes this, sanctions regime extremely seriously. And whatever legislation we end up getting, this is still going to be an issue. And so ultimately what's important is that, as an industry and as projects individually, we're not knowingly allowing or enabling money laundering by bad actors. And I think we all have an interest in weeding that out of the industry. So when we work with DeFi projects, this DeFi best practice slide is kind of what do we look for as far as like minimum level compliance. And we all understand when you're engaged in a startup, you may not have something day one, but it's something you probably want to work towards. And now luckily, I think there's a lot of tools available that help projects looking at these sort of things. But the first thing we look at is front end sanctions geo blocking, right? Is does the front end at the very least? So you may have a DeFi protocol and you'll have a front end. Does it block OFAC sanctioned countries, right? Can you reasonably be confident from a simple geo block perspective? You don't have North Korean, IPs accessing the front end of the protocol. I think that's kind of a minimum level compliance you want to be able to show to be able to be a good actor. It may not be perfect, and we could You have to always go back to the Bank Secrecy Act to see what the actual requirements are. But I think for DeFi, where it is now, having that's a no-brainer. It's also front end OFAC wallet screening. So if you're building an EVM, I think all of the sanctioned wallets are in Ethereum. Maybe there's one or two that are not on the ETH blockchain at this point. But if you're building in the EVM area, being able to block all the sanctioned wallets, right? So there's actually obviously designated wallets by OFAC which need to be blocked is a similar requirement. Also, if you're building on a non-EVM chain, you want to make sure that you're talking to these analytic tool providers. If, for example, you're building a new L1 or you're building on a new L1 to see if there are mechanisms for other users to do their own transaction monitoring. So, for example, people use chain analysis, they use TRM labs to do the analysis on these DeFi protocols to see, the whole chain of transactions to see if there's any suspicious transactions. If it's a brand new protocol, typically you're not going to be integrated, but you want to start that process as soon as possible so that everybody else can start to do that transaction monitoring. Because without it, you're not going to be able to block wallets. You're not going to be able to do the required transaction monitoring. And I made a kind of column down here for emergent best practices. I think there's some really interesting work being done on kind of protocol level integration of sanction screening. And so what does that mean, right? So it's somewhat easier to do at the front end, but there's some protocols that at the very protocol level will also be blocking OFAC sanctioned addresses and wallets. And there's different ways you can do that, and different startups are looking at ways to provide for that. But that gives you that extra level of comfort that if you're GSR and you're transacting on this pool, that I'm not otherwise engaged with bad actors. And that's just obviously a great peace of mind for regulated players like GSR. So that's that. Those are kind of just things that on my mind that we're thinking about. I think it's helpful for you all to think about. I know I spoke really fast. Anything else I didn't touch on that would be helpful to touch on? That would be helpful to talk about the election at all?
Yes, talk about the election.
Okay, fun. Um, so I'll give my opinion again, right? And this is kind of a non-political state of facts, but I think one of the questions we ask with the election when we look at a Trump versus a Harris administration is what would be the difference? And we've kind of given various comments on that. A lot of people think maybe there wouldn't be a big difference. I do think what's fair to say, and what the Trump administration, what the proposed Trump administration and Trump affiliates have said, is that how do they put it? They put it, the era of Gensler's enforcement hell will come to an end, right? So, look, they've been very clear that they would replace Gensler, and that at least this in SEC over enforcement, using enforcement as a tool to change behavior, would stop immediately. And they've said that when it comes to the outstanding cases, that it would be unorthodox to stop all those cases that have already been launched, but they would take a look at those cases and potentially consider whether any of those cases are clear losers and were brought under bad pretenses, and maybe they can potentially drop those cases. But I have a little less faith that would happen for various reasons. Under a Harris administration, I think what you'd have is a little bit more of a continuation of the same from an enforcement perspective, but what you may have is a quicker path to regulatory guidance, because I think, frankly, it becomes more of a dire concern, and that the regulation by enforcement is clearly out of control. The industry knows we need regulations, or at least clear guidance from the regulators. And if we're not going to get it from our regulators under a Harris administration, you could see a world in which Congress gets its act together, may potentially quicker to put out some legislation. I just think ultimately the industry, meaning the crypto industry, would potentially be on its back foot in that case, and you might end up with more aggressive limiting regulation than you could otherwise. So on one hand, I don't think it's fair to say that it would be the same under either outcome, but I think the way I've put it is this is the way, let me just say, the way somebody else has said it, which I totally agree with. I think this is Jake from Very Fun. He's like playing. If Harris wins, it's going to be like playing on hard mode, and if Trump wins, it's like playing on easy mode. And I think ultimately for crypto, you will see a for sure acceleration in the United States under a Trump administration, whereas I think that acceleration is less likely to occur under a Harris administration. So that's kind of our opinion, and we'll know here pretty soon which way that plays out. But we just haven't received the kind of positive signals from the potential Harris administration that you'd like to see by this point. I think they're keeping that a little close to the vest and waiting for the election at this point.
That's pretty much pretty much my thoughts too here. I'm yeah, tricky subject, but definitely very interesting next few weeks coming up for sure. Yeah, I think like someone donated like 2 million and like the XRP to Kamala's campaign, so that's interesting there too. See,
I mean, it's very fair to say that there are plenty of Democrats in Congress really interested in um, the digital assets and promoting the digital asset industry. I mean, Kristen Gillibrand in New York, a senator from New York, is one of the fiercest supporters of the industry in Congress, and she works extremely closely with senators that I think would surprise everyone, including senators from Wyoming and Alabama, on promoting responsible digital asset regulation. And so, I have no doubt that even under a Harris administration, um, there is a potential to move something forward in Congress. And the question we're asking ourselves is what would change, if anything, from an enforcement perspective, right? That could change quickly. And it just seems much less likely it would change quickly in that case.
yeah, lots of interesting landmines there. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I know it's a tricky subject.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Maybe this is like super, super simple, but what is the biggest no-no that you see projects messing up on in their first TGE? Like, what is the number one thing that you're like, man, like we see this all the time. What is that thing?
Okay, I'll give you one. This one kind of comes to mind quickly because it's kind of a very easy not to do. If you are going to be launching a token in connection with your project, it's important to really only speak to the utility of that token publicly. And that the more you speak about that token as an investment, the more you will be regulated as an investment. And so in every case the SEC brings, they always bring comms by the project that they say, look, Luna to the moon, right? Or whomever is talking about the values of the token purely as an investment and price go up and not talking, and not just talking about it as a utility. And so it's important in your early discussions with counsel, part of it should be how are you going to publicly um, you know, talk about the token, and it's just about this is where you can get the token to use it. This is how you use the token. It's not a hey, you should get in at the ground floor now at 2, it's going to be 100, because that does start to look like a security or some sort of investment contract where you're going to go work to increase the price of the token, and that can put you in a different regulatory bucket or put on the map of enforcement agent. So I think that's an easy thing that people mess up because for good reasons, right? Project founders want to build strong projects that where the price of the token goes up for their users, right? And holders. Totally understandable. I think it does make especially in the current environment, the enforcement and what I call the Howey analysis, the analysis as an investment contract, much more complicated if there's a lot of discussion around the token as an investment.
That's a really good answer.
Yeah.
And it does, I mean, you would think it does sound obvious, right? But I think a lot of people forget about it. You're right. We see it.
Well, exactly. And one of the ironies of crypto is like it's the Doge coins of the world that have the least regulatory risk, and it's the most responsible projects like Solana that tend to have high regulatory risk, right? Where there's like dedicated professional teams. What's happened is the SEC has taken that to say, well, that's the efforts of others under Howie. That looks more like a business. I'm going to make a case that's a security. Whereas if you just throw out a meme coin, well, there's no team, right? It's fully
Right.
diluted. There's no one holding it. It looks less like a security. So it promotes, in our view, the wrong types of tokens. And I think that's one of the reasons we're in meme coin season because it's just way easier from a regulatory perspective to spit out and trade a meme coin than it is a legitimate token that has fundamentals and that has cash flow associated with the protocol. Under the current regulatory regime, that makes it more complicated, right? It's just a total backwards outcome that we need to solve under with new regulation for sure.
Yep. Does anybody else have some questions?
Maybe I have one. Can you tell a little bit more if we step out from the sorry, step out from the US and go to Europe or Asia? What do you think on these regions? I think I just saw today the report from I think Allianz that's like most of startups in crypto now, not in US, move to Europe and Asia. What do you think in other regions, other jurisdictions, and how to deal with
Yeah.
that? For me, it's especially like maybe interesting. I'm located in Europe. How should I consider US as a regulator? Should I care about all this regulation on not that much as most
Right.
of
So just to think about your jurisdictional issues, even if you set up in Europe, if you are selling to US people or you are effectively dealing with US people, you can come under the auspices of US regulatory risk, right? So, even Binance, CZ was in Dubai and he ended up in a prison in California, right? So it's how are you dealing with US people? That is the nexus you have to be concerned about. And so some projects, like I'll just use a random one, right? I won't name them, but offshore prediction markets, right, will totally restrict access by U.S. persons to the platform, and then they have to make the same determination with their token where they're going to list that token or how they're going to sell it to U.S. So that's the analysis. But to your earlier point, and I wonder if Alex has view on this as well, but we still see the US market as probably the most active, but there are increasing amounts of projects, you're right, located abroad and that have been driven abroad. We see a lot of activity in Asia, increasing activity in the Middle East, and I think Europe's been a little quiet, right? Because I think part of it is where is the market um, for the tokens, and the market for the tokens has effectively been Asia and the United States, and the markets in Europe have been quiet. And so one of the questions coming out of MiCA, with MiCA going live in January, is you're going to have a regulated market for the largest GDP block in the world, right? Is that going to attract liquidity such that Europe becomes a hotspot for token launches, raises, and trading? I think that remains to be seen. And that's something boosters of MiCA will say is coming down the road. We just tend to see because of where the money's raised, right, from VCs, projects tend to be close to the spigot, and the spigot tends to be in the US and Asia. That's my 2 cents. And I think, Alex was just in Singapore, and we had a lot of people in Singapore for Token, the big conference out there, and it was wild, right? Totally totally packed. A lot of energy around crypto in Singapore, increasing energy in Hong Kong. But even in New York at mainnet, which used to be a very popular conference, it's pretty quiet. And so there is a lot of energy, I think we see in Asia, but there's ultimately less sophisticated projects there as of now. On a whole, I'm speaking very general. I'm not saying there aren't any. And the markets even still remains a little bit more wild west once you get out of Singapore, because you have a lot of influence from China and the offshore markets, which are still kind of looking for a home, I think. And so I see the world as more bifurcating regionally over the next couple of years. We're going to have this experiment in Europe. You're going to see if the US can get their house together from a regulatory perspective in the next 18 months. And then you have Asia, which is vibrant, but very bifurcated markets, with a lot of regulatory risk in China, still, but a lot of activity and hope in Singapore and Hong Kong for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, frankly, you addressed that well, Josh. Not much to add. I think, in terms of innovation, partnerships with institutions and Web2 companies, and also for users, we definitely see the US being a prime market still. And again, like all the capital, the fundraising, the big VCs are here. And then for like retail adoption, speculation, and additional use cases, like Asia is king there. So certainly agree on that bifurcation.
Well, outstanding. So we don't have anything else, Chris, unless there's anything your side can give everyone some time back.
I think we're all set if you guys are all good to break. Yeah.
I just have one question. Sorry, Kristen. This is as a corollary of what you just mentioned over here, Joshua, if we do not offer our product to US residents, we should be good with respect to SEC or any kind of compliance there.
So like I said, you have to kind of evaluate all your elements of US Nexus, right? So question is, where's your team? Where can they access the product, and can they access the token, right? And so, like we said, we have seen situations where people go totally restriction from the US, meaning no US listing, no US airdrop, no US access to the front end or whatever it is they've built. You have I can never say anything with any certainty. You have a better chance of avoiding regulatory scrutiny that way. Now, I will say, if it's no fact violation, right? If you do tornado swap, and even without U.S. people, they can come after you for sanctions, right? And you can, and that's kind of the super extraterritorial superpower. But outside of that, typically that's how you would, if you want no U.S. risk. I think that's why people in the United States realize we don't want projects to be doing that, and that we desperately need clear rules of the road so that you can not not feel like there's this necessity to block all those things. But that's why deciding where you are on that risk spectrum with your counsel is, I think, really important.